Serial Mom is a dark comedy by director John Waters. Kathleen Turner plays an over-the-top perfect housewife and mother right out of the Stepford Wives, until we learn she loves making obscene prank calls to terrorize her neighbors, and then she graduates to murdering those who slight her or her family. As people around her find out, one by one, we see how their views of her begin to change and how she, in turn, reacts to that change. I'm not a huge John Waters fan. He is visually drawn to the small grossnesses of life in a way that I find challenging to watch. This film, for example, features these extreme close-ups of people eating, and I haven't even seen any of his more notorious works, but this is easily my favorite of the handful I've seen, largely because most of the comedy actually works. It's a funny script that's even funnier with Turner's wide-eyed, innocent confidence in herself, as if she genuinely can't comprehend how she might have broken the social contract by becoming a murderer. And the film also looks great, filled with bold, cheerful colors that are a great contrast to the dark underbelly of the story. Definitely glad I picked this one up. Gas, Food, Lodging is a drama written and directed by Allison Anders about a trio of women, a mother and her two teenage daughters, living in a small western town. The oldest daughter in particular doesn't get along with their mother, and as the younger one tries to gain some independence of her own, she finds herself often caught in the middle. This is a slow, episodic story that is very empathetic toward its characters. Even with the two who are constantly fighting, we see both sides and how they're feeling, and we hope they'll open up and talk to each other. But it's the youngest daughter, Shade, whose story really captivates me. Watching her try to figure out her way through life with her mom and her sister as opposing role models is fascinating. The story doesn't always land, and there are stretches where I, as a viewer, was impatient for something to happen, but it really perfectly captures small-town, middle-of-nowhere life and the feeling of being trapped in your family's destructive habits. A good movie. Not great, but good. Trick or Treat is a horror anthology following several distinct but connected stories across one Halloween night. Our subjects include a murderer, a coven, a prank gone horribly wrong, and a haunting. None of these stories would necessarily stand up to their own 90-minute movie, but that's the beauty of an anthology. You can see several short-form stories that are more effective in their limited time frame. These are all impeccably timed. They all end right before they run out of steam. And they all have a sort of visual griminess to them that I don't love. It feels at times like maybe a more playful version of Rob Zombie, but the parts that work really work. This is also one of those movies where I found myself digging into the lore afterward, specifically the little burlap sack pumpkin costume kid who pops up briefly in each of the stories. The lore about him was more interesting than his actual appearance in the movie, but it at least intrigued me enough to make me want to look it up. Pretty decent movie. Family Business is a crime comedy drama about 3 generations of criminals, played by Sean Connery, Dustin Hoffman, and Matthew Broderick. Hoffman has done his very best to make sure that his son won't have to be a criminal like him and his father, but Broderick finds a seemingly foolproof heist and convinces them both to go in on it. There are some interesting tonal shifts in this movie. For the first 2/3, it's heavily comedic, with the dynamic between the 3 characters being played very much for laughs. And then in the final third, it shifts into something more poignant and sad and almost makes me feel a little bad for having had so much fun in the first place. It ultimately balances that shift really well. Crime movies are so not my genre, but if I've learned anything from watching through Sidney Lumet's filmography, it's that they can be really compelling if the characters are charismatic and given some stakes I can really sink my teeth into. This was an enjoyable one that I'm glad I checked out. The Ref is a comedy about a bickering couple on the verge of ending their marriage, and how their lives are changed when a burglar on the run from the police takes shelter in their home for the holidays. The bickering couple is played by Kevin Spacey and Judy Davis, and the burglar by Dennis Leary, and the humor relies heavily on the charisma and dynamics of these actors to make the film work. And it does, for the most part. It's always right on the verge of being too obnoxious, especially when it comes to Spacey and Davis's inability to keep from poking at each other's sore spots, but it always manages to rein itself back in just when it's about to cross that line. The film doesn't quite land its semi-heartfelt ending, but the banter became more enjoyable as Leary's plans kept unraveling, and by the final third of the movie, I was really enjoying it. It's also weirdly delightful seeing Glynis Johns as a villain. This doesn't always work for me, but it's probably a good Christmas movie for people who hate Christmas movies, and I had a good time with it overall. Stillwater stars Matt Damon as a rural construction worker whose daughter is imprisoned for murdering her roommate while at school in France. She insists she's innocent, but her lawyer won't reopen the case when she thinks she finds new evidence, so Damon takes it on himself to try to find the person she thinks is the real murderer. This is in many ways a familiar tale, the father coming to the rescue of his daughter, and the one thing that does stand out in a good way is Damon's performance. He doesn't seem superhumanly heroic or intelligent or good at fighting the way the men in so many of these movies do. He just seems like an average person at the end of his rope, and when he takes steps to fix things, many of them are missteps. That being said, the film itself follows a lot of familiar beats, even down to the slightly twisty ending, and Damon's performance can only go so far to elevate it. It doesn't have much new to say, and it stays pretty middle of the road, but it's alright. About Elly is an Iranian film about a woman, Elly, who was invited along on a family get-together because one of the family members hopes to do some matchmaking between the guest and one of her brothers. But when things go wrong and Elly goes missing, the family learns things they didn't know about her and scramble to put things in order and get her disappearance taken care of properly without having it reflect badly on themselves. Watching these characters work through their various reactions to this unexpected tragedy is really fascinating, and the actors do an incredible job of exuding the closeness and intimacy of true familial relations. I absolutely feel like I'm just observing them on a family getaway. The only other film I'd seen from this director was A Separation, which I admired but found difficult in its abrupt ending, and I had a similar reaction to this one. I was more on board with the characters from moment one, but the ending made so little impact that I had to actually look up the Wikipedia summary to remember how it actually ended so I could write this review. It's absolutely worth a watch, but I did hope for just a little bit more. Jungle Cruise is a film inspired by a Disney ride. Emily Blunt and Jack Whitehall play siblings who are on the search for a mystical flower said to be able to heal any illness. The only person who can get them down there and past the legendary curse of the explorers who first found it is a wildly untrustworthy river captain played by Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson. This movie very much wants to be a more diverse version of Indiana Jones for a younger generation, but it actually falls right into the same trap Indy does in its narrative, which strikes the wrong chord. It does in fact buy into the idea that this random white person is entitled to go into indigenous people's sacred lands and take their sacred items for their own purposes. And somehow this never actually gets addressed in this movie, which makes the rest of its attempts to be progressive seem really performative. And it's not all that great to begin with. The special effects here are awkward. They give the whole thing an obviously digital sheen. The chemistry between the two charismatic lead actors feels very forced, and the villain is completely uninteresting. This is just unremarkable on every level. CODA is a coming-of-age story about a high school girl who is the only hearing person in a family of deaf adults. Her brother and father work as fishermen, and she finds herself the default interpreter between them and the hearing world. But when she finds she has a shot at attending a music college, she has to figure out whether her family will understand or forgive her, abandoning them to go to school. With just a few changes, this is a story we've seen 100 times. Kid grows up, tries to separate themselves from their parents, cue hurt and healing and growth. But those few small changes do set this movie apart, particularly by moving this story into a setting we seldom see, the deaf community. The film's title, CODA, stands for Child of Deaf Adults, and the film does an incredible job of showing the very specific challenges those students may face in their teenage years. And it does it right by casting deaf actors as the deaf characters. While I don't know the community well enough to know how accurate it is, it's definitely a perspective that we see far too infrequently in film, and that in itself is enough to make this movie worth a watch. Together is a comedy drama about a single man who decides he wants to have a child on his own, and the surrogate mother he chooses to carry it. He, played by Ed Helms, is eager, nurturing, and friendly, while she, played by Patty Harrison, is fiercely private, detached, and independent. They make a great pair of unexpected companions, and since this film is essentially a two-hander, they carry the whole thing, and they do so effortlessly. These are two incredible performances, and one of the most relatable scripts I've ever heard, and it brings out a tremendous amount of charm to both these characters, as wildly different as they are. Well-scripted rom-coms have that skill of making their characters so charismatic that you just want to sit in a room and watch them interact and wish them well and smile. And even though this film definitively lacks the rom part of a rom-com, that's very much the vibe I get from this. It's heartwarming and fuzzy, but never in a way that feels disingenuous. It feels like we're just watching two people become friends, and it strikes just the right notes throughout. Well worth a watch. The girl of My Girl is 11-year-old Veda, whose widowed father runs a funeral home, and she's become perhaps a little overly obsessed with death. The film follows her throughout one summer as she plays with her best friend and bosses him around, navigates through her complicated feelings about her father's new girlfriend, and takes an adult poetry class because it's taught by the school teacher she has a crush on. All my peers watched this growing up, so even before watching it, I knew how it ended, though I won't spoil that for you here, and I expected the events of the final 15 minutes to play a bigger part in the rest of the movie, but instead it's a more meandering story than I anticipated. Anna Klumsky brings a realistic level of somewhat irritating precociousness to the title character, aside from a few scenes that I attribute to script problems rather than actor problems. That script does falter at times. It leans more heavily than I'd like into the general idea that suffering makes you a better person, which is an uncomfortable message in a children's film. Overall, it's fine, but nothing particularly special, and it definitely is clunky in places. With Honors is a comedy starring Brendan Fraser as a Harvard student, and Joe Pesci as the homeless man who ends up through a series of farcical coincidences in possession of Fraser's thesis. Pesci agrees to trade it back to Fraser one page at a time in exchange for food, a place to sleep, and other favors. The two form a begrudging symbiotic relationship that shows Fraser another side of life. This movie leans heavily into Pesci's fast-talking, high-energy style. An early scene of him defending himself in a courtroom is clearly shooting for a My Cousin Vinny comparison. It works fairly well here with Fraser as a foil for him. But I'm not as charmed by any of this as they want me to be, though, and I find myself classifying it all mostly as harmless rather than good. I do appreciate how the film avoids painting Pesci's character as some sort of all-knowing sage sent to teach arrogant kids a lesson. As we get to know him better, it's clearer that he's just an average person in need of some help, especially as his physical health begins to dwindle. It's not a stellar film, but it's sweet, and it works all right. Plan B is a teen coming-of-age comedy in the vein of Superbad or Booksmart, in which two high school girls in South Dakota go on a road trip to find a pharmacy that will sell them a Plan B pill after one girl's party hookup from the night before doesn't go as planned. This is actress Natalie Morales' directorial debut, and it's a stellar one. While I enjoyed Booksmart, I laughed at Plan B, and most impressively, it made me laugh at tropes that I usually find extremely tedious. This is a smart and funny script with pitch-perfect delivery from the two leads, as well as a tremendous supporting cast. I also appreciate the film's setting. With many teen movies happening in large cities or occasionally the suburban Midwest, it's nice to see some representation of how women in rural areas do wind up with fewer healthcare options. Overall, definitely a solid watch. In fact, between this, CODA, Moxie, and The Mitchells vs. the Machines, 2021 is turning out to be the year of great teen girl coming-of-age movies. Free Guy stars Ryan Reynolds as Blue Shirt Guy, a bank teller working in a crime-riddled city who, it turns out, is an NPC, a non-player character in a video game. He gains sentience and begins acting outside of his programming, to the great confusion of the game designers. He also gets some in-game help from a mysterious woman who turns out to be a coder whose code might have been stolen by the designer of the main game. Yeah, there's a lot of plot going on, a lot more than this goofy premise actually warrants. It's the film's biggest failing, that the conspiracy theory plot of the real world becomes far too clunky and starts taking over from what's enjoyable about the movie, Ryan Reynolds' naive optimism as a character. It really does say something that Reynolds is so capable of playing both wide-eyed innocents like this, and then also deeply jaded sociopaths like Deadpool, and making them both funny. There are enough funny moments in this movie that I can say I had a good time, but there are definitely plenty of moments that slow it down as well. Old is M. Night Shyamalan's newest movie about a group of resort tourists who go on a day trip to a beach that they soon learn ages them startlingly quickly. As children become teenagers, medical problems progress rapidly, and the older among the group begin dying, they have to figure out a way to get off the beach and back home. This reminded me very much of The Happening, in the sense that there is a genuinely terrifying premise at the core here, but the script reads like it's been written by an alien who's never seen humans interact before. It's such a shame because there are some extremely creepy moments of existential terror that could be bone-chilling in the right writer's hands, but instead we get repetitive dialogue, bizarre revelations that come out of nowhere, and deeply unrelatable responses to the crisis at hand. A lot of the film looks fantastic, and the concepts they play with are wonderfully eerie, but it all falls apart during the dialogue. I watched a video essay recently that posited that Shyamalan films almost all fare better when watched in black and white with no sound, and I'd say this is another one to add to that list. The Shadow is a film transfer of the 1930s superhero character of the same name, starring Alec Baldwin as the title character. The Shadow is a wealthy playboy who becomes a drug kingpin in Tibet after serving in the military, only to be recruited by a master of supernatural powers who offers Baldwin all his magical knowledge if he agrees to change his ways and work for good. Baldwin agrees and returns to his home to become a superhero wreaking vengeance on evildoers. The movie this reminded me of most was Dick Tracy, another extremely stylized 1990s adaptation of a 1930s character. It's definitely making some similar deliberate atmospheric choices out of realism and into a sort of aesthetic ideal of noir superhero. Those aesthetic choices are captivating, but they are unfortunately the most redeeming quality this film has. None of the performances are very interesting, and the plot is very much relying on tired tropes of Asian mysticism, and the romance is forgettable. The film's visuals may be enough to captivate viewers, but it's a flawed film on the whole. Island of Lost Souls is a 1930s film starring Charles Laughton as the infamous Dr. Moreau, who has been doing highly unethical scientific experiments on the animal inhabitants of a remote island, running them through a process that speed evolves them through thousands of years in just a short amount of time, resulting in creatures that are clearly human even if he doesn't consider them human enough. When a shipwreck survivor ends up on the island, Moreau immediately begins scheming how to use him in his experiments as well. While there are certainly some very dated elements to this film, I was pleased with how well it held up for me overall. Laughton does a lot of the heavy lifting here. He comes across as the perfect mad scientist. He's so convinced in his own rightness that it's hard to imagine anyone moving him out of the way. I find it very satisfying as well that the titular lost souls, the animals that have been speed evolved into something human, gain their moments of agency at the end, even if the film is still a little wobbly on whether or not they should truly count as human. This is a movie that's definitely of its time, but it's an intriguing one. Ruggles of Red Gap stars Charles Laughton as a British valet who was won on a bet by an American rancher whose wife is very interested in maintaining distinguished appearances, although the rancher himself doesn't care at all. Laughton finds himself very out of place in the American Northwest, but soon comes to find it might be a better place to live than he thinks. I have a special fondness for fish-out-of-water comedies, be they body swap movies or time travel movies or abrupt status changes like this one, which can often scratch that itch as well. This one doesn't quite. Partly because while the movie sets itself up as that kind of story, it's only that for about 15 minutes, before Ruggles acquiesces to his employer's demands that he loosen up and socialize with the other people of the town. And then it's about him learning to be his own person, which is kind of sweet, but not so much comedic. And it ends up leading awkwardly at times into a super pro-American nationalism, which touts personal freedom and glosses over how little the brash Americans care about each other's comfort. It ends as a very different movie than it began, and it's fine, but it's not quite my style. Annette is a wild ride. It's a musical about a comedian and an opera singer who fall in love and, Star is Born style, wrestle with their marriage when she becomes successful and he loses his platform. But then it gets darker, faster, and all involves a magical singing child played by a puppet, and there's a bunch of murder, and it's just a roller coaster. The only other Leos Carax film I've seen was Holy Motors, which I hated, but this one just blew me away. I owe a lot of that, I think, to the amazing songwriting of the musical group Sparks, who I only learned about a few months ago thanks to the documentary The Sparks Brothers. This is one of the least subtle, most operatic films I've seen in a long time, but I find it so captivating. And between this and Marriage Story, I'm finding myself really drawn to Adam Driver as an acting singer. Not because he has such an out-of-this-world voice, but because he really connects the acting and singing in a way that perfectly accomplishes both. 1 minute isn't nearly enough to talk about what I loved in this movie. Just know I loved it so very, very, very much, and I've been listening to the soundtrack a ton, and it's weird, and I wildly recommend it. Malignant is a horror film about a woman who finds herself in the center of, or having psychic knowledge of, horrible killings happening in her city. She doesn't know who's committing them, and bringing the deaths to the police's attention just makes her look like she had something to do with it. This movie lets you know right away the tone that it's going for, when the opening scene features a mysterious institutionalized patient escaping his room and causing the lights to flicker, to which a doctor says in an awestruck voice, "It's like he's drinking the electricity." And neither the dialogue nor the plot ever get less ridiculous. I have no idea how much of the film's big twist is revealed in marketing for the movie, so I won't spoil it just in case, but just know that the big reveal made me laugh out loud and yell, "What am I watching?" It does yield some fight scene gimmicks which are genuinely kind of cool, but as a whole, it's more silly and ridiculous than anything. But if you're in the mood for some goofy, gory horror, this would probably hit the spot. Candyman is a 2021 spiritual sequel to a horror film of the same name from 1992. Note that I haven't seen the original, so I can't say much about how well this sequel serves the franchise. This one tells the story of an artist who finds inspiration in his neighborhood's legend of the horrific Candyman, and the more he draws inspiration from the story, the more the story seems to be controlling his life. This film does a really great job of painting a generally horrifying atmosphere steeped in a dark, ugly history. The use of shadow puppetry to tell the Candyman legends is a very cool artistic choice that really helps to separate the myth from the reality of the story in an eerie way. That being said, the story falls apart for me a little bit at the end. It blends the lines between legend and reality in a way that made the metaphor difficult for me to track. I suspect this is me missing something though, as this all seems extremely intentional, and I would love to hear someone else's take on the ending. Reminiscence is a dystopian neo-noir that very much wants to be Blade Runner or Minority Report. Hugh Jackman stars as someone who makes his living operating the technology that allows people to relive their memories. When his girlfriend mysteriously disappears, he starts scraping his own memories and others in a desperate attempt to find her. This movie feels like someone got a great concept for a dystopian world and then couldn't figure out what to do with it. The world it creates is technically connected to the plot, yes, but none of it really connects thematically, at least not for me. The mystery would be just as home in a 1940s noir, just replacing the technologically discovered memories with diary entries or voice recordings or some other kind of recorded evidence. It almost entirely wastes this unique world and the philosophical questions it raises on a standard whodunit that isn't more engaging than the world they created, so it's clear they pursued the wrong avenue. If you're already a huge fan of the genre, this might be enough of a new twist on it to interest you, but I found it disappointing.